Good morning, everyone. We're going to start because our streaming audience is connected with us now. And we'll go ahead and do some preliminary announcements and introduce our speaker. As people are coming in from communion, our service went long because of all sorts of agenda items we had to integrate into our service. But I'm glad you're here right now. For those of you who are streaming with us, we thank you for joining us. We are now having people stream from at least 25 different states and about 15 different countries from around the world. It's quite an amazing deal, and you've tuned in to a very important day here at All Saints Church when we're focusing on the global migration crisis and also the acts of terrorism that have gripped our hearts this past weekend, and also the presence of a refugee family from Syria who've come into our midst that we are supporting. We got them settled this past Thursday. So I'm just kind of stunned at the synchronicity of all these things and that we have Roger Waldinger to address it. Before we get to him, for those of you who may be visiting with us, we welcome you. We've got red welcome bags around. They contain brochures describing all the different ministries of All Saints Church. We'd love for you to take one and let them call to you to deeper engagement at All Saints. We also would love it if you want to be on our mailing list. We have thousands of people. We send an email blast every Thursday afternoon, talking about what's going to happen in this room and in the church service. So if you'd like to be on that mailing list, we would love to include you in that. We're always happy to receive financial offerings and commitments from people to make this place happen. So if you have not pledged to All Saints, we would love to have your pledge card. We can accommodate you here at the table. Also, our speaker's book, The Cross-Border Connection, Immigrants and Their Homelands, is for sale here, and I'm sure that many of you will want to get a copy. Our speaker today is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology at UCLA. He has worked on international migration throughout his career, writing on a broad set of topics, including immigrant entrepreneurship, labor markets, assimilation, the second generation, high-skilled immigration, immigration policy, and public opinion. The author of 6 books. He is a man who informs us all about what really is going on in our lives and really what has come to the forefront of our lives, explaining how the American experience at once facilitates, competes with, and structures immigrants' involvements with the countries from which they come. He is the 2008 Guggenheim Fellow. His research has been supported by grants from the Ford Haynes Mellon National Science, Sloan and Russell Sage Foundations. He is the Interim Associate Vice Provost for International Studies and previously served as chair at the Department of Sociology and directed the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, UCLA School of Public Affairs. Regular instructor in the year-long graduate sociology seminar on international migration in comparative perspective. And I'm here to tell you that I am so very grateful that we have access to him in this moment in the history of the planet. So would you please join me in warmly welcoming Roger Waldinger.
Sure, of course. Okay, so good morning. Thank you so much for this invitation, this opportunity to speak with you today. I want to very quickly summarize the core of my presentation, and what I'm essentially going to say is that migration is essentially a way in which people are voting with their feet. They are voting against the societies from which they are coming, and they're voting for the societies which they are entering. They're doing so at the same time in which the people of those societies are not ready to accept those votes. And I think the fundamental cause of the migration crisis is really this discrepancy between what it is the migrants want and what it is that the people of the developed world in particular are prepared to accept. Now, there are a broad range of other questions that I could address. Obviously, the events of this Friday, I'll try to allude to them at some point in my talk. I'm happy to discuss them later on in the presentation. I'm not going to talk at all about the politics of immigration in the United States. Broad set of questions. Again, I'm happy to talk about with these issues with you in the Q&A. But the focus of my talk today is about the global migration crisis. Let me just very briefly preview it. I'm going to present a few very basic facts to set the context for what I'm going to say. I'm going to tell you why it is that migrants are voting with their feet, and the very simple reason is because it's good for them. I'm going to show you that many people want to move to the developed world, many more than the developed world is prepared to accept, and that once migration has begun, it is very difficult to stop. So that's the core of the problem. Many people want to migrate. People in societies like the United States or Western Europe are not prepared to accept the level of migration that would take place if everyone who wants to migrate could, and once migration has begun, it's very difficult to stop. Okay, living in a city like Los Angeles, we have the sense that the world is on the move, and in a way, if you look at this graph here, you can see where that impression comes. If we look from 1965 to the current period, we see a very large increase in the size of the global migrant population. As of 2013, 232 million people were living outside the country of origin. But if we ask what proportion of the total world population has actually engaged in international migration, the answer is, well, relatively few, and there's been relatively little change. Only 3%, little over 3% of the world's population is living outside the country of the birth. So how can we explain this discrepancy between what it is that we see and experience every day here in Los Angeles, that is, we're living in a global city that is becoming increasingly diverse every year, and yet what we see in this graph, that is, most people somehow seem to be sedentary? The answer is that there is no single global trend. That is, the core trend is this. That is, people are increasingly, those who are engaged in migration are increasingly moving to the developed world. There's much less migration in what we call the global south, whether the least developed countries or the less developed countries. By and large, people are moving from the developing to the developed world. Now, if we look at a particular country in the developed world, that is the United States, this is exactly the trend that we see. If we look, so this is a picture of the past 150 years. We see the great migration of the late 19th century, early 20th century, essentially stopping in 1924, a decline to the mid-1960s, and then a continuing rise ever since. Over 40 million foreign-born people are currently living in the United States. To give you a sense of what that means, there are more foreign-born people in the United States than there is people living in all of Italy. If we look at a share of the immigrants as a share of the U.S. population, it was over 15% 100 years ago. It then dropped precipitously, and now we are almost back to where we were at the early 20th century. So again, if we look globally, only a small share of the world's population is moving, but if we look at societies like ourselves, we see that there's a very significant transformation. And here, very briefly, what we see is the transformation in the sources of migration. Go back really even to 1960, we see the great bulk of the foreign-born population originated in Europe, but if we look today, only a very small proportion of the U.S. foreign-born population came from Europe, principally elsewhere in the Americas and increasingly from Asia. Now, a crucial point is that the U.S. experience is not unusual, that we think of ourselves as the country of immigration par excellence. But the truth of the matter is that simply isn't so. If we want to go to a real country of immigration, all we have to do is go to our neighbor that is just north of us. That is, so 12% of the U.S. foreign-born population is foreign-born. Canada is 15%. If we really want to go to a country that is an immigrant country, well, we've got to get on the plane and go to Australia, where roughly 1 out of every 4 persons is foreign-born. With even greater immigrant density in a little country like Switzerland, even more so in an even smaller country like Luxembourg. But I think the important point that I want to get across is that the U.S. experience is by no means exceptional, that it's the entirety of the developing world that is experiencing the large-scale influx of migrants coming from all over the world, to be sure, but principally this is a movement from the developing to the developed world. Now, what is it that causes this? Well, as I said, the migrants are essentially voting with their feet. Now, they're voting with their feet for the things that are most obvious, namely, they're moving to richer societies where, regardless of one's skill level, even regardless of one's legal status, one has the capacity to earn significantly more than in the country in which one lived. But I think focusing on the economic dimension is far too simplistic, and because there are a variety of different dimensions about these societies that attract immigrants. They're not simply coming to societies that are rich. They're coming to societies that, regardless of what happened in Paris on Friday, societies that are fundamentally safe and secure. Societies that provide extraordinary services to their, not simply to their citizens, but in fact to all persons living in their territories. Societies where government institutions work, societies where elections for the most part are honest, societies where for the most part government officials can be trusted. So there's a whole complex of factors that are motivating migrants to vote with their feet for the places on which they are converging. Not simply because those places are wealthy, but because those societies are significantly more functional. Now, let me give you some examples. So this is data from the United Nations, and the United Nations has developed something called the Human Development Index. So the Human Development Index is designed to measure the well-being of a society, not simply in dollars and cents terms, but looking at dimensions relating to health, relating to schooling, a variety of different indicators. And what we see, so here the UN has ordered societies in terms of from low human development to very high. We're obviously living in a very high human development society. And what we see is that the greatest gain for migrants comes from those who are coming from a low HDI society to one that are going to a high HDI society. Now we see that regardless of where the migrants come from, migration is good for the migrants, but in fact, the smallest gain is made by those who are coming from a more developed society. Now, the irony is that those who gain the greatest actually engage in the least migration. That poverty provides a tremendous motivation to leave, but at the same time, it's an obstacle. One needs resources in order to move. So the people who would most benefit from migration are actually not the ones who are doing it the most. By contrast, migration is more likely to come from these median or high HDI societies, but we see that nonetheless, even for them, migration is significantly gained. Now let me look at it in dollars and cents terms. So here, this is an effort to essentially take statistically equivalent people from a broad range of countries and ask, though these are 35-year-old men with 9 years of schooling. So that means in their societies, they would be relatively well educated. In our society, these would be people at the very bottom of the labor market. And in this, what this graph shows is not simply earnings, but actually purchasing power parity. In other words, how much with a given amount of income one can buy. And what you can see, the extraordinary disparity. So this looks at comparable people, essentially statistically the same, but you can see the tremendous gain in each case, whether Haiti, Ghana, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Guatemala, that the migrants make as a result of moving from the developing world to the developed world. Now last, a subjective indicator. So this comes from a global Gallup poll. There's an institution called the International Organization of Migration that has commissioned Gallup to conduct a series of polls about migration. And here, when the Gallup is not measuring income, but Gallup is asking the migrants themselves, as well as their counterparts in the countries of emigration, about their views of life, their own sense of the quality of life. So here, a question: which step of the ladder represents the best, worst possible life? And you can see, if it both present life and future life, the migrants have a more optimistic take relative to their statistical counterparts in the country of origin. Here, again, looking at it more negatively, did you have enough money for food, for shelter? Again, we see that the migrants have a positive evaluation of the experience in the country of migration. This is global data. This is not simply from the United States. So what we see is migration is good for the migrants. That is, migration is a fundamentally rational decision which the migrants are voting for life in a society that is significantly offers them opportunities that their own societies don't provide. Well, not surprisingly, people want to migrate. And so again, Gallup asked, ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country? And so what we see is, of course, where is the highest interest in emigration? Well, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, these are countries with, we know, very high levels of fertility, very weak states, a very high level of disorder, and indeed, a significant portion of Europe's migration problem is precisely that of trying to regulate, manage migration from Africa to Europe. Just this week, there was a meeting of European ministers with their African counterparts on the island state of Malta, and the Europeans are offering, or the European Union is offering African leaders $1.2 billion in order to try to find ways of controlling migration. But of course, Africa is not the only place in which there is interest in migration. Also, of course, the Middle East, North Africa. Now, we've tried to disaggregate this. Same question. Well, we can see that almost 60% of the people in Guyana are interested in migration, roughly similar to the Dominican Republic, about 50% in El Salvador, and on one goes. So the key point is that there are very good reasons to want to migrate, and indeed there is very great interest in migration, notwithstanding the very significant social, psychological, economic costs that are involved. Now, where is it that the migrants want to go? Well, not surprisingly, they want to go to the states of the developed world. Greatest interest is North America, Canada, the United States, Australia, France, Spain, England, Germany, and interestingly enough, Saudi Arabia. Right? So we can see, migration is good for the migrants. Well, Saudi Arabia, in the sense that Saudi Arabia has a huge demand for migrant labor. There's a large migration from South Asia to Saudi Arabia. I think that's what explains that particular finding. But the key point that I want to make are, one, we saw migration is good for the migrants, and number two, that there is a large population in the world. In some cases, more than half of the population of the country is interested in migration. Now, why is this a problem? Well, the answer is that the people of the developed world don't want migration. Now, this is, again, I'm falling back on the Gallup organization, which takes polls both on a worldwide scale and, of course, in the United States. And here we have almost 50 years of polling. Now, there is an optimistic lesson to be drawn from this poll, and that is, we can see the blue is question is, should immigration be increased, decreased, or stay the same? And we can see that the proportion saying that it should be increased goes from about 8% in 1965 to almost a quarter in 2012. So there is a slight increase in support for immigration, not immigrants, but immigration. But by and large, the majority of the American population either wants immigration levels to be capped where they are or wants them to be diminished. So there's this asymmetry, this misfit between what is it that the people of the developing world want? Many of them want to migrate. And what is it that the people of the developed world want? They want migration, if not to stop, to at least be controlled. Now, who are the people who want migration to be either stopped or controlled? Well, in some ways, one has to say, it's all of us. That is, so here I break again, this is data from not a Gallup survey, a different survey, but I try to break the American population into its different components, so by ethnicity, by ideology. And what's striking is, in no case is there even a plurality that wants migration to be increased. So the largest, roughly a quarter of Hispanics are interested in having migration increase, but we see that among liberals it's 13%, among blacks it's 14%, so that even in this time of extreme polarization in U.S. politics, in some ways the U.S. population is agreed on one thing, and that is that migration should, at the minimum, be controlled. There simply isn't a constituency for increased migration. Now, we like to beat ourselves up, but the truth of the matter is that the Americans are no worse, maybe no better, but no worse than our counterparts elsewhere in the world. So these are data now from a Pew Global Survey. The question is, should your country have stronger measures to exclude illegal aliens? Should immigration be reduced? And of course, the patterns are not identical, but we can see a general consensus over the 60% level in virtually every country for stronger measures to exclude illegal aliens. And in many countries, Great Britain, Germany, France in particular, a very strong consensus that immigration should be reduced. So again, there is this general global pattern in the developing world in interest in migration. Why? Because migration is good for the migrants. But in the developed world, consensus is the opposite, that there is too much migration. And in part as a result of this ideological opposition to migration, the public actually exaggerates how many immigrants are to be found in their midst. So that is the fear and the concern over immigration magnifies the sense of threat. Now, what's very important to note is that contemporary migration is taking place in an era of globalization. So the very same people who are opposed to the entry of foreign people are, of course, completely supportive of the purchase of foreign things. I mean, I assume that everybody in this audience has a cell phone in their pocket or their pocketbook. None of those cell phones are made in the United States. We're all happy to engage in globalization when it meets our own individual ends. But what's again, I'll just show you a little data. Here, a question about trade. What do you think about the growing trade and business between your country and other countries? And we can see in less support in the United States than elsewhere, but certainly in Western Europe, a very high level of support for trade. So this is, again, a crucial part of the contemporary crisis. There is the demand for migration in the developing world, the opposition to increased migration in the developed world, but the participation of everyone in the ongoing process of globalization. Now, a crucial aspect of globalization is, of course, the international trade of things and services, but it's also the circulation of people. And so migration is just a small component of the circulation of people. The United States, of course, all of us who have been at airports know, there's an extraordinary flow of people entering and leaving U.S. territory all the time. Most of the people crossing into the United States, as is true, people crossing into Europe, do so for very short periods of time. They enter, they leave. Some of them come for longer periods of stay. They may be foreign students. They may be exchange professors. They may be temporary workers in Silicon Valley. Some of them are temporary workers in agriculture. But by and large, there is a huge flow of people entering and then leaving. And so a core problem in the implementation of migration control is that we're living in a world that is increasingly open, a world in which we can't actually maintain the international flow of goods and services without having an almost equally large international flow of people. But migration policy is designed to filter out just a small portion of that flow of people. Of course, it's very difficult when one has so many people moving in and out to calibrate it in the way that the domestic populations would like. So the consequence of this disparity between the demand for migration and its opposition is that the United States, and as I'll show you, other countries as well, have moved to policies involving increasingly drastic levels of enforcement at the border. So here we can see the federal spending for enforcement, border enforcement, interior enforcement, other expenditures for enforcement. We know that spending for all sorts of other domestic priorities has either stagnated or declined, but in the United States, spending for immigration enforcement seems to know no limits. We listen to the Republican candidates, and they're telling us this is simply not enough. We should double or triple the expenditures. In fact, the U.S. Border Patrol and Immigration Customs Enforcement receive more federal funding than any other federal funding for any type of police function. Okay, we know what the consequences of greater enforcement at the border. They are, of course, they are increased death, increased fatality, increased entry. So any of you who have been to southern San Diego County know that there is an extraordinary wall now that divides Tijuana and Chula Vista. And the whole goal of that wall is to push potential undocumented immigrants into areas of the Southwest that are much more hostile, to essentially use the land barriers as a way of impeding migration. Well, what the consequence, and that's what's shown here, is the increase in migration fatalities. So this is each dot indicates a death, and so we can see that this is Arizona, the huge increase in migration fatalities, and this is the Mexican side of the wall. There are basically two walls. This is a wall that is made of metal sheets that had been used during the Vietnam War to unload army material as it went from the ships onto Vietnam, and then there's a second, much larger concrete wall. Now, again, I want to emphasize that the trends that we see in the United States are, in fact, very similar to the trends that we see elsewhere in the developed world. So, I think unbeknownst to many people, there were actually two little parcels of Spain that are found on the African coast, Ceuta here in northern Morocco and Mejia. So these are parts of Spain, and what's really important to say is not only parts of Spain, they're parts of the European Union. So that once a migrant makes it into one of these little enclaves, they essentially have carte blanche to go anywhere else in the European Union. Well, the consequence, of course, is a fence that makes the fence on the U.S.-Mexican border look relatively trivial. But there are constant. This is a picture of a still from a video, and hopefully you can see these are mainly African migrants who are attempting to climb the walls, and they're constant rushes of large numbers of men trying to climb over these walls, get over the fortifications, and into Ceuta and Melilla. Now, the consequence of this type of enforcement, this is a map from 10 years ago, showing migrant deaths on the marine and land border. So one can see right here, near the Straits of Gibraltar, the large numbers of deaths caused as a result of efforts to go from North Africa to Spain, likewise to Italy, and then, of course, in the area where right now, between Greece and Turkey, Greece and Italy. So the European Union has essentially, on the one hand, in 1989, early 1991, the so-called Iron Curtain fell, but the European Union has effectively been building a curtain of a different type around the borders of the so-called Schengen region. Again, with the same types of, what we see in Arizona, the increased migrant fatalities is what is being seen in Europe as well. Two last points. You know, mainly when we talk about immigration, we're thinking in terms of immigrants, in terms of individual people. But what we forget is that these individual people are part of families. And another way of thinking about immigration is that it's a process by which families get internationalized. Some people move from country of origin to country of destination, but they leave behind relatives. They leave behind parents, they leave behind spouses, they leave behind children, they leave behind siblings and other relatives. And so, and the result then is that we live in a world in which migration has produced interconnections between place of origin and place of destination. In countries where there's high level of emigration, large fractions of the population have relatives living abroad. We're no longer talking about populations that are separated by territory, but instead populations that are interconnected. So one can see, case of Haiti, almost half of all Haitians have a relative living abroad. Mexico, an immediate relative. Mexico, over 25%. Now, the presence of migrant relatives living in the countries of immigration facilitates migration. These are the people who provide the information. These are the people who pay for the migration. These are the people who lodge the new migrants. These are the people who find jobs for the new arrivals. Again, I'll give you few more statistics. This is data from Mexico. So roughly 50% of the Mexican population have relatives abroad. And so this is a question about, would you be interested in emigrating? And one can see that the proportion of the population interested in immigrating increases significantly as they have more contact with relatives in the United States. So there is this process by which migration really creates more migration, because the new immigrants provide the resources for the arrival of the latecomers. Okay, here's another example. This is from a survey in Spain. So again, I want to emphasize that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. Spain historically was a country of emigration, became a country of immigration during the 1990s and 2000s. So we can see that almost everyone, so about 15% of the respondents said they had no contact in Spain before arriving, so almost everybody had a contact. Roughly 20% had a relative. 40% had someone whom they could go to for help after arriving, and almost 50% said that their decision to leave was influenced by a contact to someone already living in Spain. So what we see is that this is a historically determined process, that migration in time 1 produces subsequent migration in time 2. All right, so let me try to sum up. From a policy perspective, the key point is that migration can be managed. And how do we know that migration can be managed? We know that because, in fact, there is much less migration than there would be if the borders were open. We see 60% of the population in Guyana say they want to migrate, but they're not leaving. Most of them are staying home. And migration controls, from that perspective, are actually very effective. They are exercising a very significant deterrent effort. But that deterrent effort is not as great as what the population of the developed world would like. And so there is this core discrepancy between what the reality is. The reality is that many people want to migrate. The controls that exist are deterring many, but there are still many more moving than the people of the developed world want to accept. So in a way, you can ask, what is the solution? The solution is a greater accommodate may not be the most humane solution, but the practical solution is an accommodation to the reality. We need, in effect, political leaders who are prepared to tell the population of the United States, the population of the developed world, that international migration is here to stay. There is no wall that can stop it. There is no magic wand that can stop it. Large-scale migration is here to stay, in large measure because of all of the strengths of our society. Everything that society like the United States or France or Britain or Germany or Canada or Australia has to offer, these are the things that beckon people from the developing world. So in a way, it's an indicator of our strength that so much migration takes place. So the path of rationality is to find a way to accommodate it and manage it, not to deny the reality. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to take questions. I could talk a little bit more about the refugee crisis, but I've said the essence of what I hope to say.
Do we have microphones ready to come to? Very good. Right here is one. And over here is a great, Nancy. Now, before we start the questions, I'm so interested to see, Roger, in this room, if you don't mind holding up your hands, if you have a family member who lives in another country. That's pretty amazing. That's really what you're talking about. It's just amazing. Nancy, please. Roger. Go ahead, it's on.
It is. Could you tell us what are some of the agencies that are working to better the conditions in these developing worlds so that it would be more attractive to stay where they are? Who's working on that?
Well, I mean, a significant amount of money is being, the developed world provides a significant amount of developed aid. Of course, the United States lags greatly behind other developed states. But I think, what one sees I mentioned this conference in Yalta between European leaders and African leaders. So much of the development aid is really instrumentally oriented. I mean, this meeting is one that is generated not by an interest in helping African states in order to provide help or because help is the good thing. It is rather that it's self-interested. Development is seen as a way of stopping migration. So I don't think, again, development is a long-term process, but the migration is impelled by the conditions on the ground today. So it may be that over the long term, development will reduce migration. And I think, if we look south of the border, look at Mexico, it's clear that the moment of high-level migration from Mexico has stopped. Stopped in part because the Mexican economy has grown. It's stopped in part because Mexican population growth has greatly declined. So it's not inevitable that migration will continue without stop. But the underlying sources of migration are such that they can't be turned off in a moment.
I understand that many European countries have a low birth rate. They're not reproducing, 1.6%. And in a sense, I was wondering if some of these countries with low birth rates were welcoming immigrants because you need a certain amount of growth to continue your economy.
Well, I think in part, one of the reasons behind Germany's relatively generous response to the refugees is related to precisely the point you made. That is, Germany is slated for population decline, and so Angela Merkel and other German leaders see the influx of refugees as a way of arresting that population growth. But the fact is that for the most part, European populations are not willing to accept that message. Italy is a country with a history of emigration, but it has also experienced a very significant decline in fertility, and yet it is not prepared to accept immigration. Even better case is Japan. Japan's population is rapidly aging, fertility is far below replacement levels, but Japan has repeatedly been unwilling to accept migration. Given its location, it has the capacity to control migration relatively well. But again, one sees some of the underlying irrationalities in the migration crisis. The migrants, I think, are acting rationally. They're doing what is good for themselves and for their families. It's really the states of the developed world that have lacked the capacity to accept the reality as it is.
Roger, before we go to the next
Yes.
question, and while we're thinking about Germany, can you just speak to the impact of a country's ethical history in how they receive or reject migrations?
Well, I mean, it's hard not to think that, that Germany's response to the wave of Syrian migration isn't on some level an effort at redemption. I mean, it's obviously rooted in Germany's effort to come to grips with the legacy of the Holocaust. I mean, I think there is also self-interest, but I think that there is an underlying, I think, moral impetus. In a way, this is a question that we should pose to ourselves. I mean, that is that Germany is accepting 800,000. There are currently 800,000 asylum seekers in Germany. If we translated that to the United States, ask how many, proportionate to U.S. size relative to Germany, how many asylum seekers would we have to accept? The answer is 3.5 million. So currently, I mean, Obama has created a big controversy by saying we'll accept an additional 20,000 Syrian refugees, bringing the total up to 100,000. So, I mean, I think that I really haven't focused on the refugee question in this talk. Obviously, I mean, the causes are different, but the world is in crisis. There are 60 million people who are displaced by war, by internal disruption, by some type of crisis. So these are the highest levels of, largest levels of displaced persons that the world has really seen since World War II. The United States responded quite generously to the outflow from Southeast Asia in the late 1970s. There's a recent article in I think this issue of the New Yorker, describing a trip that Rosalind Carter made to a refugee camp in Thailand in the late 1970s, and that seems to have had a significant impact on the willingness of the Carter administration to increase refugee admissions. And the author of the article asked, well, what would happen if Michelle Obama were to go to a camp in Jordan or Lebanon? Would that have a similar reaction? But the task that's facing us is really immense.
Last question. Bob?
Do you have anything to say about the advantages and disadvantages to the receiving country? The argument in this country seems to focus on jobs. Some people say it loses jobs. Other people say it creates jobs. There are other arguments, too. Is there any other studies? Do you have a point of view?
Yeah, this is, again, a deep irony. There's a library of studies about the impact of immigration on the countries of immigration. And at least in terms of the economic impact, the answer is it's a wash. That is, the negative consequences are roughly comparable to the positive consequences. So the people will say, I mean, reputable scholars will say it's a little more positive, a little more negative, but by and large, the consensus of 40 years of research is it's a wash. So that, I think, points to the irrationality of the response. This is really, it's not about self-interest on the part of the developed world. This is a symbolic, a cultural issue. This is a question of who are we? What type of people do we want to be? And ultimately, it's the refusal to accept outsiders, refusal to accept the cultural change associated with migration that is the source of so much opposition and antagonism. Now, I mean, I think every community is bounded. So I'm not advocating unlimited open borders. I think a moral case can be made for open borders. I think it's difficult to think about a world in which we have open borders and yet we have self-governing countries and self-regulating societies. But I think there's no question that the opposition to immigration is not rooted in economic self-interest, but it's rooted in issues related to culture and symbolism.
Thank you, Roger Waldinger.